The word EMF, or electromagnetic field, is a broad one, and contained in it are the things that evolve around electric appliances and power lines, extremely low frequency fields. And this EMF issue also encompasses radio frequency radiation and microwave radiation. And those are emissions that you get from cell phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi and WiMAX, wireless communications. So it's really broadly all of those things that either give us electric power or that give us the ability to communicate in a wireless fashion. And there are emissions, and they have important biological effects. We're seeing brain tumor risk increase at 10 years and less of use. What you need to know with that is that almost everything else that can cause a brain tumor, mostly chemical exposures or ionizing radiation, take 20 years for these tumors to show up. Why is it we're seeing this increase start at 10 years with cell phones? Well, it means that cell phones are a very, very effective way of creating brain tumors, and it's happening in half the time, because most people think it takes a lot of exposure to a cell phone to have an increased rate of brain tumors show up. And in fact, we're beginning to see it with only 260 lifetime hours of exposure. You begin to see the risk with only 260 hours. Leonard Hardell's work looks toward the top end of users, the heavy users, and he looks at anybody with 2,000 or more lifetime hours of exposure, and he's seeing very substantial and statistically significant increased risk of brain tumors and acoustic neuromas with 2,000 or more hours. Well, you know, I work with people, I know people who average 900 minutes a month. So in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, a year. I mean, I do the calculation, but a couple of years and you've hit your maximum. I have great concern that for the brain tumor and acoustic neuroma risk, the threshold for danger is so low. You're over it, you're over it, you're over it. We're all over it if we've used a cell phone in work for a few years, 3 years, 5 years. Cordless phones as well as cell phones are implicated not only in heat shock protein or stress protein responses, but they're also they look to be just as deadly as cell phones when you look at brain tumors and acoustic neuromas, another form of tumor in the head. So importantly, people need to know that it isn't just mobile phones, but it is also cordless phones that are showing increased risk of brain tumors. We had decided that we would write a state-of-the-art report on electromagnetic fields and health risks. And we would use this to alert people in the world whose mission it is to translate science into good public health policy, about why it is that there are 30 years worth of scientific studies documenting bioeffects and adverse health effects from these exposures, and yet we are still living with the same old standards we've had for years. Martin Blank from Columbia University contributed the chapter on heat shock protein or stress proteins. When you see heat shock proteins being expressed by cells or being created, it means the cell is in trouble and it's hollering help. It's got a problem with the environment around it that isn't good for it. And what Martin has been able to show is that when you're exposed to very low levels of electromagnetic fields, we see stress proteins created. And what that tells us is that maybe in the short term, you know, the body will get over it or it'll adapt. But if you do this day in and day out, chronically, these things have very serious consequences for the body. And they are actually a part of the plausible biological mechanism that we talk about for ultimate chronic health problems and diseases and threats to health, which can be carcinogens or they can be neurotoxins. Martin Blank's work, of course, has just been key for this, and the levels at which he's finding the effect on stress proteins are environmental levels. They are levels to which most people in urbanized countries are exposed. People become electrically sensitive. They become hypersensitive to exposures. Like many people are chemically sensitive to chemicals, there's a growing percentage of people in the world, estimated between 3 and 8% of everyone in the world, that is electrosensitive. This EMF issue also encompasses radio frequency radiation and microwave radiation. And those are emissions that you get from cell phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi and WiMAX, wireless communications. So it's really broadly all of those things that either give us electric power or that give us the ability to communicate in a wireless fashion. If you look at this issue in terms of what we should have learned from smoking and lung cancer and secondhand radiation and cancer, I would simply do this for parents. If you wouldn't buy these for your kids, and these are candy cigarettes, you certainly wouldn't want to buy a candy toy cell phone, because I think in 10 years we're going to be looking at these two as equally harmful, meaning the real McCoy, real cigarettes, real cell phones. And there is no excuse to start children off using these cell phone devices at an early age and probably even into young adulthood, considering that their brains are still hardwiring and brain development and neurological development isn't complete until your early 20s. We have no business providing kids with things that are probably going to turn out to be more dangerous than cigarettes. Certainly in the short term, the brain tumor risk is going to be higher. So for childhood leukemia, which is a done deal, I mean, there's really no more question. Power line exposures, electromagnetic field exposures cause childhood leukemia, at least some part of it, and maybe a very big part of it. In schools, it's become popular to install wireless internet connections for children's laptops. The exposure that a child would get in a school, going through a school like this, and from elementary to middle school to high school, would be very considerable over a lifetime. And we really recommend against it now because it appears that it's an experiment where we don't know the health result, and it isn't worth the risk. Can we quantify the risk yet? No, because we're not allowed to do experiments on children. But every indication is that if wireless technologies and their emissions have such a big impact on adults from the studies we have, it will be worse on children. The industry would like for you to think that we have to have conclusive scientific evidence, which is just a ridiculously high level of proof before we do anything at all. And this just is not the case. In smart public health policy, you react when you begin to see the evidence mounting up and the trend is toward showing an effect. You don't wait until the industry is finally willing to admit that it can't hide the fact anymore that they're selling a carcinogen. So if you buy the argument that you need proof, absolute proof, and proof according to the industry that you have harmful substances with these devices, then you would wait. But I can't imagine any parent saying a cell phone and the use of a cell phone is so important to my child and my family that we will risk this and wait for proof. They're going to act on the evidence. There's a big industry push to either keep the status quo or to relax standards in general among industries, from the electric utility industry in Australia to almost all the telecom organizations that lobby throughout the world. And in fact, even in the United States. It's amazing today that in the United States, the IEEE, which is the body that recommends new standards for radio frequency, for example, from cell phones, is proposing to loosen or to make less tough the standards we have right now for radio frequency radiation from cell phones. They want to allow the amount of heat a phone can put into your brain to be calculated over 10 grams of tissue rather than 1 gram like it is today. And that means you could have far higher exposures. And the cost to society over time, if we do nothing, are going to be enormous. So we have all the makings of an early warning here. And we don't just need trivial or do-nothing kinds of cures. We are so far down the road in understanding the problem that we are calling for very substantial change. The biological effects that we see are occurring thousands of times lower than our standards. We need new standards. It's fine to keep the old ones because the old standards protect us against being burned or being cooked or being electrocuted. What they don't do is protect us against cancer and diseases like Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease, miscarriage, and the other constellation of things that we strongly suspect are occurring. So we think we need an entirely new set of standards to address these new technologies, and they need to be biologically based. What that means is we ought to look at these 2,000 studies or more, and we ought to see what kind of biological effects are occurring, and we ought to design new standards that protect us and provide a safety factor below the levels where we're seeing risks start. We need a complete top-to-bottom review, and in the interim, I think we need to halt the deployment of these new technologies and the deployment of and proliferation of base stations or cell towers until we are able to say with some better certainty we know how to do it right, because right now it's clear we're doing it wrong.